Winter 1946. On a train carrying German war orphans to America, through a humanitarian program, a group of American women stood quietly waiting at the station. They had lost husbands, lost sons in the war. But when they saw those hollow, gaunt eyes, they didn't see enemies but children who had never been held. In silence, one woman stepped forward, took the trembling blonde boy's hand, and whispered softly, "Welcome home, son." In that moment, two worlds, victory and wounds, merged into one. The autumn of 1945 had painted Boston in shades of exhaustion. Victory parades had long since swept through the streets, leaving behind only the echo of celebration and the weight of absence. In the brownstone houses of Beacon Hill, wives still set two plates at dinner out of habit, then quietly removed one with trembling hands. Mary Elizabeth Sullivan stood at her kitchen window, watching the maple leaves surrender to November's grip. At 43, she carried herself with the measured grace of someone who had seen too much and said too little. Her auburn hair, streaked with premature silver, was pulled back in the practical style she'd worn throughout her years as a battlefield nurse in the European theater. The war had ended, but for Mary, peace felt more like an armistice with grief. The radio crackled to life from the living room, interrupting the silence that had become her constant companion. President Truman's voice filled the empty spaces between furniture that once accommodated a family of 3. The War Orphans program will provide sanctuary for European children whose families were destroyed by the conflict. These innocent victims of war deserve our compassion, regardless of their nationality. Mary's hands stilled on the dishcloth she'd been wringing, the plate she'd been drying, one of the good china pieces her mother had given her for her wedding, reflected her face in its white surface. She saw the lines that had deepened since David's telegram arrived from the War Department. "We regret to inform you that your son, Lieutenant Thomas Michael Sullivan, was killed in action." The radio continued. "Opposition to the program has been vocal, with many Americans questioning whether we should care for German children when our own families are still mourning." Margaret O'Brien, her neighbor from across the street, had knocked on her door yesterday with a copy of the Boston Herald folded to an editorial titled "Coddling the Enemy's Young." Margaret's own boy had come home from Normandy missing his left arm and most of his faith in humanity. "It's not natural, Mary," Margaret had said, settling her considerable frame into Mary's kitchen chair. "We don't owe them anything, not after what they did to our boys." But Mary had seen the children in the displaced persons camps during her final months in Europe. They weren't miniature stormtroopers or junior Nazis. They were hollow-eyed ghosts who flinched at sudden movements and hoarded bread crusts in their pockets. They were Thomas's age, or younger. They were someone's sons. The telephone's shrill ring cut through her reverie. She dried her hands on her apron, a habit from her nursing days when sterile protocol meant survival, and lifted the heavy black receiver. "Mary? It's Catherine Whitman from Street Vincent's." The voice belonged to the hospital administrator, who had expedited Mary's transition from military to civilian nursing. "I have something I think you should know about." Catherine's words came measured and careful, the way she delivered news about terminal diagnoses. "The Archdiocese is coordinating with the federal program to place some of these German children. They need temporary foster families while the paperwork processes. People with experience. The euphemism hung between them like smoke. Experience with trauma. Experience with loss. Experience with the particular silence that follows violent death." "How many children?" Mary heard herself ask. 3 brothers, ages 8, 10, and 12. They've been together since 1943. No one wants to separate them. Through her kitchen window, Mary watched the elderly gentleman from 2 houses down rake leaves into neat piles that the wind immediately scattered. His movements were methodical, patient. He would rake the same leaves tomorrow, and the day after, until winter buried them all. "Their names?" she asked. "Hans, Lucas, and Otto Zimmerman. They arrived next Tuesday on the 3:15 train from New York." After Catherine hung up, Mary remained at the kitchen table as twilight painted the room in shades of gray. She pulled out the wooden writing box David had given her for their 15th anniversary and withdrew a sheet of cream-colored stationery. "Dear Mrs. Whitman," she began, her pen moving with the same steady precision she'd once used to record vital signs under artillery fire. "I would like to volunteer as a temporary foster placement for the Zimmerman boys." Outside, streetlights flickered to life one by one, pushing back the darkness that threatened to swallow Beacon Hill whole. Mrs. Henderson from next door was pulling her blackout curtains closed, a wartime habit she couldn't shake, like so many others who had lived through the long nights of uncertainty. Mary sealed the letter and walked to the front door, where Thomas's coat still hung on the third hook from the left. She touched the rough wool briefly, then opened the door to post her letter in the mailbox. The November air bit at her cheeks as she stepped onto the front stoop. Boston spread out below her like a constellation of windows lit against the dark. In those windows, families were gathering for dinner, sharing the small intimacies that make a house a home. Children were being tucked into bed with stories and kisses. Mothers were checking locks and listening for the sound of their children's breathing in the rooms down the hall. In 3 days, that same train station where she had said goodbye to Thomas would welcome 3 boys who spoke a different language but carried the same fundamental need: to be someone's son again, to be chosen rather than simply assigned. Mary pulled her cardigan tighter and went back inside, where the radio was still murmuring about post-war reconstruction and the challenges of healing a broken world. She turned it off and climbed the stairs to what had been Thomas's room, where 3 beds now waited to be filled. The freight car stank of unwashed bodies and fear. Hans Zimmerman pressed his back against the wooden slats and tried to make himself smaller, the way Sergeant Krantz had taught him during those final months, when the Reich was crumbling and desperate men turned children into soldiers. At 12, Hans was the eldest, which made him responsible for Lucas and Otto in ways that should have belonged to adults. His brothers slept fitfully against his shoulders, their breathing shallow and quick like frightened animals. Lucas, 10 years old but small for his age, still sucked his thumb when he thought no one was looking. Otto, the baby at 8, hadn't spoken a complete sentence since the night the Americans found them in the rubble of what used to be their school. The train swayed through the American countryside, carrying its cargo of displaced children toward uncertain futures. Hans had learned English from a British POW in the final camp, trading bread rations for lessons. The words felt strange in his mouth, angular and harsh compared to the soft sounds of his mother's Bavarian dialect. Through the gaps in the wooden slats, he caught glimpses of a country that didn't look bombed. Houses stood complete with glass in their windows. Children played in yards that weren't cratered with shell holes. The normalcy of it made his chest tight, with something between longing and resentment. "Wo sind wir?" Lucas whispered, asking where they were in the German that was forbidden in their new country. "America," Hans replied in careful English, the way they had been instructed. "We are in America now." But America felt like another word for nowhere. They were refugees, displaced persons, war orphans, clinical terms that meant the same thing: unwanted. The Red Cross worker who processed their papers in New York had smiled with professional kindness and handed them each a small American flag, as if patriotism could be distributed like rations. Hans remembered his father's hands, broad and gentle, teaching him to whittle wood in the evenings before the war came to their village. He remembered his mother's voice singing him to sleep, the weight of her hand on his forehead when fever burned through him. Those memories lived in a different world, one that had been erased as thoroughly as their hometown had been reduced to rubble. The other children in the train car represented a catalog of war's casualties. There was Greta, whose parents had hidden Jews in their basement until someone informed on them. Klaus, whose father was executed for desertion when he tried to come home to his dying wife. Maria, who had been found living alone in a bombed cathedral, caring for a doll she insisted was her baby sister. They were all ghosts of children, too old for their years and too young for the weight they carried. The American officials called them war orphans, as if being orphaned by war was somehow different from being orphaned by disease or accident, as if the specific nature of their loss made them more exotic, more worthy of pity, more dangerous. Hans had learned to read the faces of adults. There was the softening that came with sympathy, the hardening that came with suspicion, and the careful blankness that came with professional duty. The Red Cross workers wore that third expression most often. They were kind in the way that people are kind to wounded animals, gentle but distant, careful not to get too attached to something that might not survive. The train began to slow, its brakes squealing against the rails like an animal in pain. Through the slats, Hans could see buildings growing closer together, the countryside giving way to the outskirts of a city. Boston, they had been told. A place where people spoke with strange accents and the harbor smelled of salt and fish instead of cordite and death. Ich habe Angst, Otto whispered. I'm scared. Hans shifted so he could look at his youngest brother. Otto's eyes were the same pale blue as their mother's, but they had lost the capacity for wonder that should have been his birthright. Instead, they held the careful wariness of someone who had learned that safety was temporary and kindness often had conditions. Remember what Mama told us, Hans said quietly in English, though he wanted to comfort his brother in German. We take care of each other. Always together. It was a promise that had kept them alive through the bombing of their village, through the displacement camp, through the ocean crossing in a ship full of strangers. It was the only thing left from their old life that hadn't been taken, lost, or destroyed. The train lurched to a stop with a final screech of metal against metal. Outside, voices called in English. Sharp, efficient, American voices that carried the authority of a country that had won its war. Hans gathered the cloth bag that contained their few possessions, a change of clothes for each boy, the wooden cross their mother had pressed into his hand before the soldiers came, and the small notebook where he had been teaching himself to write English words. The doors of the freight car slid open with a bang that made all the children flinch. Sunlight streamed in, momentarily blinding them after hours in the dim car. American soldiers stood silhouetted against the light, their uniforms clean and well-fitted, their faces hidden in shadow. Come on, kids, one of them said in English slow enough for them to understand. Time to meet your new families. Hans took his brother's hands and stepped toward the light, toward America, toward whatever waited for 3 German boys in a country that had every reason to hate them. Mary arrived at South Station 20 minutes early, her hands clasped so tightly in front of her that her knuckles had gone white. The cavernous space echoed with the sounds of arriving and departing trains, the shuffling of feet, and the low murmur of voices in a dozen languages. Displaced persons from across Europe passed through Boston daily now, but today felt different. Today, she was not an observer but a participant. The other women in the Catholic Charities group stood in a loose cluster near Track 7, each holding a manila folder with information about their assigned children. Eleanor Hartwell, a widow from Cambridge whose husband had died at Anzio, kept checking her watch and smoothing her navy dress. Patricia Kelly, whose 3 sons had all enlisted and only 2 had returned, fingered the rosary beads in her coat pocket. Remember, said Sister Margaret, the nun coordinating the placements, these children have experienced trauma we can barely imagine. They may not respond to affection immediately. Patience will be your greatest virtue. Mary nodded, though her mind was elsewhere. Last night, she had dreamed of Thomas as a boy, running through their backyard with a wooden sword, declaring himself a knight on a quest to save the kingdom. She had awakened with the strange sensation that he was trying to tell her something, that his death had not been an ending but a doorway to something else. The 3:15 from New York pulled into the station with a great hiss of steam and screech of brakes. Mary's heart hammered against her ribs as uniformed officials began helping children down from the train cars. They emerged, blinking into the dim light of the station like creatures emerging from hibernation. Small, thin figures clutching canvas bags and cardboard suitcases. Then she saw them. 3 boys descending the train steps with careful precision, the oldest holding the hands of the 2 younger ones. The boy in the middle, that would be Hans, had wheat-colored hair that caught the station's electric lights and eyes the color of a winter sky. His face was gaunt but determined, and he moved with the careful control of someone much older than his 12 years. Mrs. Sullivan? Sister Margaret appeared at her elbow. Those are your boys. Mary's breath caught in her throat. They looked so small against the vastness of the station, so alone despite being together. Hans was scanning the crowd with the wariness of a soldier, his body positioned protectively in front of his brothers. She approached slowly, the way she had learned to approach wounded soldiers who might bolt from sudden movements. When she was 3 feet away, Hans noticed her and immediately pulled his brothers closer, his thin shoulders squaring as if preparing for a blow. "Hands?" Mary said softly, crouching down to bring herself closer to their eye level. "I'm Mary Sullivan. I'm going to take care of you." The boy's eyes met hers with a directness that was unsettling in someone so young. She could see him evaluating her, measuring her against some internal scale of trustworthiness. His English, when it came, was careful and precise. "We stay together," he said. It was not a request, but a statement of non-negotiable terms. "Yes," Mary replied immediately. "Always together." Something shifted in Hans's face, a slight relaxation around his eyes. He looked down at his brothers, speaking to them in rapid German that Mary couldn't understand but recognized as reassurance. The middle boy, Lucas, peered out from behind Hans's shoulder with curious eyes, while the youngest, Otto, remained hidden. Mary extended her hand toward Hans, palm up, the way she might offer her hand to a frightened animal. "Will you come home with me?" For a long moment, Hans stared at her outstretched hand. Mary could sense the war being fought behind his careful expression. The desire to trust battling against the hard-learned lesson that adults could not be trusted. That safety was an illusion, that love was a luxury, that war had stolen from him. Slowly, carefully, Hans reached out and placed his small hand in hers. His fingers were cold and thin, but they gripped hers with surprising strength. "Ich bin sorry," he whispered, the German slipping out before he could stop it. Mary felt something break open in her chest, a dam giving way to a flood of emotion she had been holding back since the telegram arrived. She closed her fingers gently around his hand and spoke the words that would change both their lives. "Here, you don't need to say sorry to be loved." At the sound of her voice, Otto finally emerged from behind his brothers, his pale blue eyes wide with something that might have been hope. Lucas stepped closer, drawn by the warmth in Mary's tone that needed no translation. In the noise and chaos of South Station, with steam still rising from the train and strangers hurrying past with their own urgent business, 4 people who had been broken by war found each other and began the slow work of becoming a family. The brownstone on Marlborough Street rose before them like something from a storybook Hans had read in the camp. 3 stories of red brick with white shutters and window boxes that would hold flowers come spring. The front steps were swept clean, and the brass knocker on the dark green door gleamed in the afternoon Sunday. Mary unlocked the door and gestured for the boys to enter first. Hans stepped across the threshold with the careful deliberation of someone entering foreign territory, his brothers close behind him. The house smelled of lemon polish and something warm that might have been bread baking. It was the smell of a home that was cared for, lived in, loved. "This is the living room," Mary said, speaking slowly so they could follow her words. The room was furnished with a sofa covered in faded blue fabric, 2 armchairs by the fireplace, and a radio cabinet against the far wall. Family photographs lined the mantelpiece. Wedding pictures, baby pictures, and one that made Hans look away quickly. A young man in an American uniform, smiling at the camera with the confidence of someone who didn't know he was going to die. Otto had stopped in the doorway, overwhelmed by the space and warmth. In the camps, they had shared a single room with 12 other children. Privacy had been a forgotten concept. Quietness, a rare luxury. Here, the silence felt different. Not the silence of people afraid to speak, but the gentle quiet of a place where peace was possible. "Are you hungry?" Mary asked, noticing how their eyes had fastened on the plate of cookies she had set on the coffee table. Hans translated quickly for his brothers, and all 3 nodded with the cautious eagerness of children who had learned not to trust abundance. In the kitchen, Mary moved with practiced efficiency, setting out plates and glasses of milk while the boys sat at the round oak table like visiting dignitaries. The bread she had baked that morning was still warm, and she watched their faces as she cut thick slices and spread them with butter, real butter, not the margarine they had grown accustomed to. Hans bit into his slice with careful control, chewing slowly as if memorizing the taste. Lucas and Otto followed his lead, but their eyes kept darting to the windows, checking for escape routes or signs of danger. They ate like soldiers, Mary realized. Quickly, efficiently, ready to abandon their meal if circumstances required it. After you eat, Mary said gently, I'll show you your room. Hans paused mid-chew. Zimmer? He asked in German, then caught himself. Room? One room? Yes, one room. I thought you'd want to stay together. Relief flooded Hans's face so completely that Mary felt her heart constrict. How many times had these boys been separated and reunited? How many promises had been broken? How many times had they been told they would stay together only to wake up in different places? The room had been Thomas's, but Mary had transformed it carefully over the past 3 days. She had moved out the baseball trophies and model airplanes, replacing them with 3 beds positioned so the boys could see each other as they fell asleep. The walls were painted a warm yellow, and new curtains filtered the afternoon light into gentle patterns on the wooden floor. Hans entered first, as always, scanning for threats that would never come but that his body expected anyway. When he saw the 3 beds, each with its own pillow and blanket, his careful composure almost cracked. This is ours? Lucas asked in halting English, the first full sentence Mary had heard from him. This is yours, Mary confirmed, for as long as you want it. Otto ran to the middle bed and sat on the edge, bouncing slightly on the mattress. In the camps, they had slept on thin pallets that provided little comfort and no security. A real bed with springs and blankets was a luxury beyond their previous experience. That evening, Mary prepared what she hoped would be familiar food, potatoes and sausage, simple and filling. She had been reading about German cuisine in the library, trying to create bridges between their old world and new. But when she called them to dinner, she found Hans at the kitchen window, standing at attention with his shoulders squared and his hands at his sides. Hans? She approached slowly. What are you doing? Waiting for permission, he said without looking at her. Permission for what? To eat. To sit. To be here. Mary felt something cold settle in her stomach. How many times had these children been made to stand at attention? How many meals had they been denied? How many simple human needs had been turned into privileges that could be withdrawn? She knelt beside him so their eyes were level. Hans, look at me. When his pale blue eyes met hers, she spoke with all the gentleness she possessed. You don't need permission to be a child here. You don't need permission to be hungry, to be tired, to take up space in this house. This is your home now. Hans's eyes filled with tears he was too proud to shed. Behind him, Lucas and Otto watched with the careful attention of children who knew their fate depended on how their brother was treated. Relax, Mary said softly, using the German word she had looked up that afternoon. Du bist sicher here. You are safe here. For the first time since stepping off the train, Hans let his shoulders drop. The soldier disappeared, and in his place stood a 12-year-old boy who had forgotten how to simply be 12. The screaming started at 2:17 a.m. Mary had been lying awake, listening to the house settle around its new inhabitants, when Hans's voice cut through the quiet like a siren. She was out of bed and up the stairs before she was fully conscious, her nursing instincts overriding everything else. She found him sitting bolt upright in bed, his eyes wide open but seeing something that wasn't there. His brothers flanked him on either side, Lucas speaking to him in rapid German, while Otto clutched his arm. They had clearly done this before, had developed their own protocol for managing their brother's nightmares. Hans, Mary said softly, approaching the bed slowly. You're safe. You're in Boston. You're with me. But Hans was still in 1943, still watching his father being dragged from their house by soldiers in gray uniforms, still hearing the single gunshot that had ended everything familiar about his world. His breath came in short gasps, and sweat darkened his hair despite the cool October night. Mary had seen this before in the field hospitals of France. Battle fatigue, they called it then, though she suspected it was something deeper and more lasting than fatigue. The mind's inability to accept that the danger had passed, that the body could afford to lower its defenses. She sat on the edge of Hans's bed, careful not to touch him until he was ready. Can you tell me where you are? she asked. Hans's eyes slowly focused on her face. The terrible distance in them gradually receded, replaced by the careful awareness that had become his default state. Entschuldigung, he whispered. Sorry. No apologies, Mary said firmly. Not for this. Never for this. She had learned enough German in the past week to understand their whispered conversations, and she knew that Hans carried guilt like other boys carried toys. He blamed himself for not protecting his parents, for not being strong enough to keep his family together, for surviving when others hadn't. At 12, he had appointed himself responsible for tragedies that had been set in motion by men in offices hundreds of miles away. Lucas, who had been silent since Hans woke up, finally spoke. He dreams about Papa, he said in careful English. Every night, Mary felt her heart constrict. In the boys' files, she had read the clinical description of their father's execution. Shot for suspected resistance activities. But the bureaucratic language couldn't capture what it meant for 3 young boys to watch their father die for the crime of trying to protect his neighbors. Would it help to talk about him? Mary asked gently. Otto, who rarely spoke at all, surprised her by answering. Papa made toys, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. From wood. He taught Hans to carve. Hans's hands, which had been clenched in his lap, slowly relaxed. He was making a horse for Otto, he said, the words coming slowly, as if each one had to be excavated from somewhere deep inside him. When they came for him, he was in the workshop. The horse was almost finished. Mary had noticed Hans's hands during his first days in her house, the way he examined wooden furniture with professional interest, the way he unconsciously rubbed his thumb against his fingertips as if testing their sensitivity. A craftsman's hands, inherited from a father who had died before he could pass on all his skills. I have some wood in the basement, she said quietly. Tools, too. My husband used to work with his hands. It was the first time she had mentioned David to the boys. Their marriage had been filled with the kind of quiet contentment that didn't announce itself, but simply existed. Steady and reliable as sunrise. He had been a teacher before the war, but his hands had always been busy with small projects, fixing things, building things, creating beauty from raw materials. Hans looked at her with something approaching surprise. You would let me? I would let you do whatever brings you peace. The next day, she led the 3 boys down to the basement, where David's workshop remained exactly as he had left it 4 years ago. His tools hung in neat rows on the pegboard, and a thin layer of dust covered the workbench where he had spent countless evenings crafting small gifts for Mary and Thomas. Hans approached the tools with the reverence other children reserved for religious artifacts. He lifted a small carving knife, testing its weight and balance, and Mary saw tears gather in his eyes. Papa had one like this, he said. He said the wood tells you what it wants to become. Over the following weeks, the basement became Hans's sanctuary. After school, for Mary had enrolled all 3 boys at the local elementary school despite some resistance from other parents, he would disappear downstairs with a piece of scrap wood and emerge hours later with curls of shavings in his hair and something approaching peace in his face. He was carving a horse, she realized. The same horse his father had been making for Otto when the world ended. Each evening, she would find him in the basement, his thin shoulders bent over his work, his hands moving with the patient precision of someone much older. Lucas and Otto would sit on the stairs and watch, occasionally offering suggestions in German that made Hans smile, the first real smiles Mary had seen from any of them. In the soft light of the basement workshop, surrounded by the smell of wood shavings and the quiet scrape of blade against grain, they were no longer war orphans or displaced persons. They were simply brothers, connected by memory and love and the ancient human desire to create beauty from raw materials. When Hans finally finished the horse, 3 weeks later, he placed it silently on Otto's pillow. His youngest brother clutched it against his chest and spoke the first complete sentence Mary had heard from him. Papa would be proud. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in November, delivered with the casual efficiency that made hate seem almost mundane. Mary found it slipped under her front door while she was preparing breakfast for the boys, her name written across the envelope in block letters that suggested the writer had been trying to disguise their handwriting. "Mrs. Sullivan," it began, "we know what you're doing, harboring enemy children in our neighborhood. American boys died fighting their kind. Have you forgotten your own son's sacrifice? Get them out or we will." Mary's hands remained steady as she folded the letter, but something cold settled in her stomach. This was the fourth such message in 2 weeks, each one more explicitly threatening than the last. The first had been almost polite, suggesting that perhaps she had been misguided in her charity. The latest had included a crude drawing of 3 stick figures hanging from a tree. Upstairs, she could hear the boys getting ready for school. The quiet murmur of their voices in German, the shuffle of feet on wooden floors. Hans had finally convinced his brothers that they could speak their native language at home, though they maintained careful English in public. It was a small victory in a war Mary was only beginning to understand. The campaign against the War Orphans program had been building steadily since the first children arrived. The Boston Herald ran daily editorials questioning the wisdom of importing enemy youth when American families were still counting their losses. Radio talk shows featured callers who spoke with passionate conviction about the dangers of German infiltration, as if 8-year-old Otto was somehow a sleeper agent waiting to activate. At the grocery store, Mary had begun to feel the weight of sidelong glances and conversations that stopped abruptly when she approached. Mrs. Patterson, who had been her neighbor for 15 years, now crossed the street rather than exchange pleasantries. The pharmacist, who had always been friendly, became coolly professional, fulfilling her prescriptions without the usual small talk about the weather or local news. But it was the incident at Hans's school that forced Mary to acknowledge how dangerous the situation had become. She received a call from the principal on a Thursday afternoon, his voice carefully neutral, as he explained that Hans had been involved in an altercation during recess. "What kind of altercation?" Mary asked, though she could already imagine. Some of the older boys cornered him behind the gymnasium. They were testing his loyalty, asking him to denounce his homeland. When he refused to say that all Germans deserved to die, things became physical. Mary closed her eyes. "Is he hurt?" "Bruised ribs, split lip. Nothing that won't heal. But Mrs. Sullivan, I have to tell you, this isn't the first incident. There's been name-calling, exclusion from games, deliberate isolation. The other children see Hans and his brothers as representatives of everything they've been taught to hate." That evening, Mary found Hans sitting on the back steps, holding an ice pack to his swollen jaw. His school shirt was torn at the shoulder, and there was dried blood under his fingernails where he had fought back. "Want to talk about it?" she asked, settling beside him on the cold stone. Hans shrugged with studied casualness. "They said we killed their brothers. What did you tell them?" "Nothing." "What could I tell them? That we were children when their brothers died? That we lost our papa too? They don't want to hear that Germans can be victims." Mary was quiet for a long moment, watching the last light fade from the November sky. "You know what I think?" she finally said. Hans looked at her with cautious curiosity. "I think people need someone to blame when they're hurt. It's easier to hate children from far away than to accept that sometimes terrible things happen for no good reason. So we're supposed to be their hate?" Hans asked. The question was too sophisticated for a 12-year-old, but war had stripped away his right to childish simplicity. "No," Mary said firmly. "You're supposed to be their redemption. You're supposed to prove that love is stronger than hate, that peace is possible, that children don't inherit their parents' sins." It was then that Mary made the decision that would define the rest of their lives together. She stood up, brushing off her skirt, and looked down at this brave, wounded boy who had somehow become her son. "Tomorrow," she said, "I'm calling a meeting of the neighborhood women. It's time to stop hiding and start fighting back." The meeting convened in Mary's living room on Sunday afternoon. 6 women came, mothers who had lost sons, wives who had lost husbands, sisters who had lost brothers. Eleanor Hartwell brought her knitting. Patricia Kelly brought her skepticism. Catherine Morrison brought her fierce Irish temper and her certainty that children deserved protection, regardless of their nationality. "I'm not asking you to forget your losses," Mary said, standing before the fireplace where Thomas's photograph watched from the mantelpiece. "I'm asking you to remember that hatred keeps wounds from healing. I'm asking you to help me prove that American mothers are strong enough to love even the children of their enemies. The silence that followed was charged with possibility. Outside, a cold November wind rattled the windows. But inside Mary's living room, 6 women who had been broken by war began to plan their reconstruction. They would call themselves the Mothers of Peace. They would speak at churches and community centers. They would write letters to newspapers and lobby politicians. They would stand as living proof that a mother's love could transcend nationality, that the heart's capacity for healing was stronger than its capacity for hatred. Hans, listening from the top of the stairs, understood that his life had just been changed again, not by violence or politics or the decisions of distant adults, but by a group of American women who had decided that enemy children deserved to become someone's sons. December arrived in Boston with the kind of bitter cold that made everyone walk faster and hunch deeper into their coats. For Hans, Lucas, and Otto, it was their first Christmas in America, though the concept of celebration felt foreign after years of survival mode. The camps had observed Christmas with makeshift services and shared rations, but joy had been rationed more carefully than food. Mary had been planning for weeks, aware that every tradition she introduced might become either a bridge to healing or a painful reminder of what the boys had lost. Their family's Christmas customs had died with their parents, buried under rubble and grief and the systematic destruction of everything familiar. "We don't have to celebrate," she told Hans one evening as they sat in the living room after dinner. If it's too difficult, Hans considered this with the careful deliberation he brought to all decisions. At 13 now, he had quietly marked his birthday in November without mentioning it to anyone. He carried the weight of his brother's emotional well-being like a physical burden. "Otto asked me yesterday what Christmas was like before," he said finally. "I couldn't remember. Not really. Just pieces." Mary nodded, understanding. Trauma had a way of fragmenting memory, preserving some details with painful clarity, while erasing others completely. Hans could recall every detail of his father's death, but couldn't summon the sound of his mother's laughter. "Maybe we could make new memories," she suggested. "Start fresh." The decision to celebrate came gradually, built from small moments and tentative hope. Mary took them to choose a tree from the lot on Charles Street, where the boys marveled at the tradition of cutting down a perfectly good pine just to bring it indoors. The concept seemed wasteful to children who had learned to value every scrap of usable material. But Otto's eyes lit up when he saw the trees dusted with snow like something from a fairy tale. They selected a modest fir, tall enough to reach Mary's shoulder but not so large as to overwhelm the living room. Hans and Lucas carried it home between them, their breath visible in the cold air, while Otto skipped ahead to announce their return to the house. Decorating became an exercise in cultural translation. Mary had saved the ornaments from Thomas's childhood Christmases, but she found herself explaining each tradition as they unwrapped delicate glass bulbs and strings of lights. The boys listened with the intense concentration they brought to learning English, filing away each custom as another piece of their adopted culture. "In Germany," Lucas said as he hung a silver bell on a low branch, "we had candles on the tree. Real ones." "That sounds beautiful," Mary replied. "And dangerous." Papa always watched, to make sure nothing caught fire. His voice carried the wistful quality that meant he was accessing a memory from before, when the world had been safe and parents had protected their children from danger instead of being powerless to protect themselves. Otto, meanwhile, had discovered the Christmas stockings Mary had hung on the mantelpiece. 3 new stockings joined the ones that belonged to Mary, David, and Thomas, a visual representation of how the household had contracted and then expanded again. The boy studied them with puzzled interest. "They're for gifts," Mary explained. "Small ones. Santa Claus fills them while you sleep." This required a lengthy explanation of American Christmas mythology, which the boys received with the same polite skepticism they applied to most American customs that seemed designed more for entertainment than survival. But Otto, the youngest and still most capable of believing in magic, latched onto the idea with unexpected enthusiasm. Christmas Eve arrived with a light snow that transformed Beacon Hill into something from a postcard. Mary had prepared a simple meal: roasted chicken instead of the traditional turkey, which felt too celebratory for their circumstances. And after dinner, they gathered in the living room for the exchange of gifts. Mary had knitted sweaters for each boy, practical woolens in colors that would complement their fair coloring. Hans opened his with careful precision, examining the cable pattern with the eye of someone who appreciated craftsmanship. Lucas pulled his on immediately, running his hands over the soft fabric with wonder. Otto buried his face in his sweater and announced that it smelled like home, though none of them were entirely sure what home meant anymore. The boys had pooled their meager resources to buy Mary a small brooch from the 5 and dime store. A simple pin shaped like a snowflake, nothing elaborate, but chosen with careful consideration for her taste. When she pinned it to her dress and proclaimed it beautiful, their faces lit up with the pride of gift-givers whose offering had been truly appreciated. But it was Hans's final gift that broke open the carefully maintained emotional control they had all been practicing. From beneath his bed, he withdrew a wooden box he had carved in David's workshop, its surface smooth and gleaming with hours of patient labor. Inside, nestled in a bed of wood shavings, lay 3 small figures carved with extraordinary detail: a man, a woman, and a young boy. "It's us," he said simply. "Our new family." Mary took the box with trembling hands, understanding the magnitude of what Hans had given her. He had carved them into existence, had made their unlikely family permanent in a way that transcended law or paperwork or the temporary nature of foster care. In wood and skill and hope, he had declared that they belonged to each other. "I never had a mother," Hans said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Until you." The words hung in the air between them, weighted with everything they had lost and everything they had found. Mary gathered all 3 boys into her arms, and for the first time since Thomas's death, Christmas felt like a celebration rather than an endurance test. Outside, church bells began to ring across Boston, calling the faithful to midnight services. Inside Mary's living room, 4 people who had been strangers 3 months ago held each other and understood that family was not something you were born into but something you chose to build, one careful day at a time. The man appeared on a Tuesday morning in February, when Boston was locked in winter's most relentless grip. Mary first noticed him through the kitchen window as she prepared breakfast, a figure standing motionless across the street, studying her house with the kind of systematic attention that made her uneasy. He was tall and thin, dressed in a wool overcoat that had seen better days, and there was something about his posture that suggested military training. When she looked again an hour later, he was gone. But something about his presence lingered, a disturbance in the routine that had become their life. Hans noticed him too. Mary could tell by the way the boys' shoulders tensed as they walked home from school, by the frequency with which he checked over his shoulder, by the return of the hypervigilance that had defined his first weeks in America. Hans had developed finely tuned instincts for danger, and those instincts were screaming now. "There's a man watching the house," Hans said that evening, his voice carefully controlled. Mary set down her teacup. "I saw him too." "Do you recognize him?" Hans shook his head, but she could see the uncertainty in his eyes. 3 years in displacement camps had exposed him to hundreds of adults, and faces had a way of blending together when you were trying to survive. But something about this particular man had triggered recognition, even if Hans couldn't quite place him. The man introduced himself 2 days later, knocking on Mary's front door with the polite persistence of someone who would not be deterred. When she answered, he removed his hat and spoke in accented English that immediately identified his nationality. "Mrs. Sullivan, my name is Werner Zimmerman. I believe you are caring for my brother's children." The words hit Mary like a physical blow. She had read about Werner in the boys' files, Friedrich Zimmerman's older brother, a career soldier who had served on the Eastern Front until a Russian shell fragment destroyed his left leg and sent him to a military hospital. The records indicated he had been presumed dead, lost in the chaos of Germany's collapse. But here he stood on her doorstep, very much alive and looking past her into the house where his nephews were doing homework at the kitchen table. She could hear their voices in German, discussing a mathematics problem with the easy familiarity of brothers who had learned to rely on each other. "May I come in?" Werner asked, and though his tone was polite, Mary recognized it as less request than expectation. She led him into the living room, acutely aware that this man had a legal claim to the boys that superseded her own. Uncle trumped foster mother in any court, regardless of circumstances or the children's preferences. Her hands trembled as she gestured for him to sit, and she clasped them tightly to hide her fear. Werner declined her offer of coffee and went straight to the point with German efficiency. I have been searching for the boys since the war ended. The displacement authorities told me they had been sent to America, but the records were incomplete. It has taken me 18 months to trace them here. They're doing well, Mary said, though the words felt inadequate. They're in school. They're healthy. They're German, Werner interrupted. They belong with their family, in their own country. The boys had heard the unfamiliar voice and crept to the doorway, where they stood frozen in tableau. Hans's face had gone completely white, and he was gripping his brother's hand so tightly that Lucas winced. Otto had partially hidden behind Hans, peering around his older brother with wide, frightened eyes. Werner saw them and spoke in rapid German, his tone warm and reassuring. But the boys didn't move, didn't respond with the joy of children reunited with beloved family. Instead, they pressed closer together, a defensive formation Mary had seen them use in moments of extreme stress. Uncle Werner? Hans said finally, his voice uncertain. Ja, mein Junge. Yes, my boy. I have come to take you home. The silence that followed was deafening. Mary could see the war being fought behind Hans's eyes. Duty to family versus loyalty to the woman who had become his mother. Obligation to the past versus commitment to the future he had begun to build. This is home, Otto said suddenly, his small voice cutting through the tension. This is our home now. Werner's expression hardened. America is not your home. You are German citizens, and you will return to Germany with me. No. The word came from Hans, quiet but final. We stay here. Mary felt her heart break and soar simultaneously. Hans was choosing her, choosing the life they had built together, but she knew the choice might not be his to make. Legal guardianship was a complex web of international law, and blood relationships carried weight that love alone could not match. The decision is not yours to make, Werner said, standing. I am your legal guardian now. I will be filing the necessary paperwork to have you returned to Germany. That night, after Werner had left with promises to return with official documents, Mary found Hans sitting on the floor of the workshop, staring at his hands. The wooden horse he had carved for Otto sat on the workbench beside him, and she realized he was memorizing it, storing up the details against the possibility of loss. We could fight this, she said quietly. Hans looked up at her with eyes that had seen too much. Could we win? Mary wanted to lie, wanted to offer false reassurance the way adults did when they were trying to protect children from harsh realities. But Hans had already survived one world built on adult lies, and he deserved better from her. I don't know, she admitted, but we could try. The courtroom in the Suffolk County Courthouse smelled of old wood and older justice. Hans sat between Mary and the lawyer she had hired, a kind woman named Elizabeth Brennan, who specialized in immigration cases. Across the aisle, Werner Zimmermann sat with his own attorney, a stern man who spoke of blood rights and family obligations as if they were natural laws rather than human constructs. Judge Patricia Adamson presided with the weary authority of someone who had seen too many cases where the law and justice diverged. She was a woman in her 50s, with gray hair pulled back severely and eyes that missed nothing. The case before her was unusual, not just custody, but a question of nationality, belonging, and what constituted a child's best interest. This is highly irregular, Judge Adamson said as she reviewed the papers before her. We're essentially asking a 12-year-old boy to choose his citizenship, his family, his entire future. Elizabeth Brennan stood. Your Honor, Hans Zimmermann has been in Mrs. Sullivan's care for 6 months. He has adapted to American life, excelled in school, and formed emotional bonds that would be traumatic to sever. While we acknowledge Mr. Werner Zimmermann's legal relationship to the children, we believe that Hans's own wishes should carry significant weight. Werner's attorney, a man named Coleman who spoke with the efficiency of someone accustomed to winning, responded immediately. Blood relationships supersede emotional attachments formed under extraordinary circumstances. These children belong with their family, in their homeland. The temporary comfort they may have found in America cannot outweigh their cultural identity and heritage. Hans listened to the adults discuss his life as if he were not present, as if his own feelings were evidence to be weighed, rather than the central reality of the situation. He had written a letter to the judge, as Elizabeth had suggested, but holding it in his hands now, the words seemed inadequate to capture the complexity of what he felt. Judge Adamson turned to him directly. Hans, I understand you have something you'd like to say to the court. Hans stood on legs that felt unsteady, his letter trembling in his hands. In the gallery behind him, he could sense Mary's presence like a warm anchor, and Otto and Lucas sat beside her, their faces pale but determined. The courtroom was packed with reporters and social workers and advocates on both sides of the War Orphans program, all of them waiting to see what a German boy would choose when forced to pick between blood and love. Your Honor, Hans began, his English careful and precise. I want to read what I wrote. He unfolded the letter, noting how his handwriting had improved over the past months, how Mary's patient tutoring had transformed his cramped Germanic script into something more fluid and confident. Dear Judge Adamson, he read aloud. My name is Hans Friedrich Zimmermann, and I am 12 years old. 6 months ago, I came to America with my brothers because we had nowhere else to go. We were orphans of war, and we expected nothing from America except maybe food and a place to sleep. I did not expect to find a mother. Mrs. Mary Sullivan took us into her house when no one else wanted German children. She fed us when we were hungry, held us when we had nightmares, and taught us that we could be safe again. She never asked us to stop being German. She learned German words to comfort us, and she let us keep our father's memory alive. But she also taught us what it means to be American, to believe that people can change, that the future is more important than the past, that children don't have to pay for their parents' wars. My uncle says I belong in Germany because I was born there, but I think belonging is not about where you were born, it is about where you are loved. Germany is the place where my parents died, where soldiers made me carry a gun, where I learned that the world was cruel and unsafe. America is the place where I learned to carve wood again, where I go to school with children who are becoming my friends, where I have a mother who chose me, even though she didn't have to. I choose America. I choose her. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Hans folded the letter carefully and looked directly at Judge Adamson. I know my uncle loves us, he continued without the letter now, speaking from his heart. I know he wants to take care of us. But Mrs. Sullivan already does take care of us. She makes us feel like we belong somewhere, like we're wanted for who we are, not just because we're family. He turned to look at Werner, whose face was unreadable. Uncle Werner, you are my father's brother, and I will always remember that. But she is my mother now, the only mother I have left. Judge Adamson was quiet for a long moment, studying the faces before her. This case will require careful consideration, she said finally. I will issue my ruling in 1 week. As they left the courthouse, reporters surrounded them, shouting questions about international law and adoption rights, and the symbolism of German children choosing America over their homeland. But Hans only heard one voice, Mary's, as she put her arm around his shoulders and whispered, Whatever happens, I'm proud of you. That night, the Boston Globe ran a headline that would be remembered for decades. The boy who chose love. Beneath it was a photograph of Hans walking down the courthouse steps, holding Mary's hand, with Otto and Lucas pressed close beside them. They looked like what they were, a family that had been forged by choice rather than birth, strengthened by love rather than obligation. September 1966. 20 years had passed since a frightened 12-year-old boy stepped off a train from New York and into the arms of a woman who would become his mother. Dr. Hans Sullivan. He had taken Mary's name legally when the adoption was finalized. Stood in the doorway of the house on Marlborough Street, his medical bag in one hand and a bouquet of fall chrysanthemums in the other. At 32, Hans had grown tall and lean, with the steady hands of a surgeon and the quiet authority of someone who had learned early that words carried weight. He wore his Army Medical Corps uniform, with the same careful precision he had once brought to standing at attention as a child soldier. But now the uniform represented healing rather than destruction, service rather than survival. The house looked smaller than he remembered, though Mary had maintained it with the same meticulous care she brought to everything in her life. The brass knocker still gleamed, the window boxes still held seasonal flowers, and the front steps were swept clean as always. But there were signs of age now. Paint touched up in slightly different shades, a handrail added for safety, the gradual accommodation of time and mortality. Mary answered the door before he could knock, her face lighting up with the joy that had greeted him every day for 20 years. At 63, she was smaller than he remembered, her auburn hair completely silver now, but her eyes held the same warmth that had first made him believe in the possibility of love. "There's my doctor," she said, reaching up to embrace him. He bent down to accommodate her height, breathing in the familiar scent of lavender soap and coffee that would always mean home to him. Inside, the house was exactly as he remembered, and completely transformed. The same furniture occupied the same positions, but the walls now displayed 20 years of accumulated family life, photographs of graduations and weddings, certificates and awards, the visual record of 3 German boys becoming American men. Lucas had graduated from MIT with a degree in engineering and now worked for a company designing bridge foundations. His mathematical mind, which had once calculated rations and distances to safety, now solved problems of stress and load-bearing capacity. He lived in San Francisco with his wife Patricia and their 2 young daughters, who called Mary Grandma and sent her crayon drawings of their family. Otto had surprised everyone by becoming a teacher, drawn to children who struggled with reading the way he had once struggled with English. He taught at an elementary school in Chicago, and his letters to Mary were filled with stories of small victories and breakthrough moments. He had never married, pouring his considerable capacity for love into his students instead. "How are you feeling?" Hans asked as they settled in the living room where he had first learned what safety felt like. "Old," Mary said with characteristic honesty. "Tired, but grateful." The diagnosis had come 3 months ago. Cancer. Aggressive and already advanced. The doctors had given her 6 months, maybe 9 if she responded well to treatment. Mary had listened to their careful explanations and gentle suggestions with the same calm attention she had once brought to medical briefings in field hospitals, then asked practical questions about pain management and prognosis. Hans had wanted to take leave immediately, to spend every remaining moment with the woman who had saved his life. But Mary had refused, insisting that he finish his current rotation at Walter Reed Hospital. "I didn't raise you to abandon your patients," she had said with a firmness that brooked no argument. Now, watching her pour tea with hands that trembled slightly, Hans felt the familiar helplessness of a doctor who could heal others but not the person who mattered most. He had learned to save lives, to repair damaged bodies, to give families hope when hope seemed impossible. But he could not save Mary from the simple, inexorable fact of human mortality. "I've been thinking about your father," Mary said, settling back in her chair with her teacup balanced on her lap. "Your biological father, I mean." "Friedrich." Hans looked up in surprise. In 20 years, Mary had never discouraged the boys from speaking about their birth parents, but she rarely initiated such conversations herself. "I never met him, obviously," she continued. "But I see him in you sometimes. The way you work with your hands, the way you think through problems, the way you love fiercely but quietly. I think he would be proud of the man you became. He didn't have the chance to shape who I became," Hans said quietly. "You did that," Mary smiled, the expression transforming her lined face into something beautiful and timeless. "We both did. Your past and your present, your heritage and your choices. You're not German or American. You're both. You're who you needed to become." They sat in comfortable silence as the afternoon light slanted through the living room windows, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air like memories made visible. Hans thought about the boy he had been. Traumatized, angry, suspicious of love, because love had been torn away from him so brutally. That boy lived inside him still, but he was no longer in charge. Instead, he had become the foundation for the man Hans had chosen to be. A healer, a protector, someone who used his understanding of trauma to help others find their way back from darkness. "You took my hand and called me son," Hans said, echoing words spoken 20 years ago in a train station. Mary reached across the space between their chairs and took his hand in both of hers, her wedding ring clicking against his class ring from Harvard Medical School. "And you healed my heart," she replied. Outside, the American flag hanging from their neighbor's porch stirred in the September breeze, its movement catching the light like a prayer made visible. Inside, a woman who had lost one son and found 3 others sat holding hands with the boy, who had taught her that love multiplies rather than divides, that choosing family is sometimes stronger than being born into it, that mothers and sons can find each other across oceans and languages, and the terrible arithmetic of war. The house on Marlborough Street held them both, as it had for 20 years, as it would in memory long after the last light faded from the windows and the last story was told. Some families are given by birth. Others are forged by choice, tempered by time, and strengthened by the simple, revolutionary act of love, without conditions. War had brought them together, but peace had made them family. And that, Hans thought as he sat holding his mother's hand in the gentle light of a September afternoon, was the only victory that ultimately mattered.